Welcome to the first section of the course. In this section, we will learn the fundamental language of web development, which is HTML. And to get started, let's now learn what HTML actually is and what we can do with it. So basically, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And remember how we learned earlier that HTML is one of the core web technologies along with CSS and JavaScript. Now, HTML is a markup language that web developers use to structure and describe the entire content of any web page. And notice how I said markup language. That's because HTML is actually not a real programming language. It's a markup language because we use it to describe something. And in the case of HTML, we describe content using different HTML elements. So basically, HTML consists of different elements that we can use to describe different types of content. So we have different elements to create paragraphs, links, page headings, images, video, and a lot more. Now, you might be wondering, why do we need to describe our content like that using all these HTML elements? Well, the reason is that web browsers, such as Google Chrome, actually understand HTML code and can then render the HTML that we write as actual web pages that we can see and use. Okay, so this is essentially what HTML is and what we can do with it. But now let's zoom in a little bit and take a look at the anatomy of an HTML element. So basically, taking a look at the building blocks of each HTML element. And here we are looking at the paragraph element, as you can see by the P. So all of this is actually called the element itself. Now, as we can see, an HTML element is usually made up of three parts. First is the opening tag, which is the name of the element. So in this case, it's the P wrapped in the less than and the greater than symbols. Then, after that, we have basically the content of the element. So in this example, that is just some text, but there might be other types of content. For example, an element can contain another element inside of it, which we then call a child element. Also, some elements, such as images, have actually no content at all and only have an opening tag. Finally, after the content, we need to close the element by using the closing tag. So the closing tag is basically the same as the opening tag, but with a slash in front of the P. So we open the paragraph element simply with the P, and then we close it with /P like this. Okay, and that's really all you need to know in order to start learning HTML in practice, which is exactly what we will do in the next lecture. Let's now finally start building our application by writing our very first lines of HTML code. But before we can do that, we need to first create a project folder. Now, you can do that anywhere you want in your file system. I will simply go here to my desktop and create a new folder. And since this project is called Today I Learned, I will simply name this folder Today-I-Learned. Okay, let's open it up also, because I already have the starter files here that we downloaded in the first section. So right here. And so now I'm going to move these two files into the project folder that I just created. And so you should do the same right now, and then you can even get rid of this folder right here. So now we only have our project folder, and in here we have the two starter files that we are going to need a little bit later. Okay, so let's move back to VS Code, so the code editor that we installed in the previous lecture, and then here we can open this project folder. So we can either click on open here, or here in this left sidebar. And that doesn't really matter. So we just click open folder and then this one. So we don't select any file, we simply select this entire folder. Then hit open. And so now this folder is actually our project folder. And we can see that because here now we have the name of the folder. So Today I Learned. Okay. Then we can close this one up. And now let's create a new file. So our very first HTML file. So we hit this small button here, and then we call it index.html. So the .html is of course a file extension for HTML files, and the name of index is the usual name that we always give to the main HTML file of any website. So this is a standard name, index.html. All right, and so now let's start writing some HTML. So every single HTML document always starts with the HTML element. So HTML, and then VS Code will actually automatically create the closing tag for us. So remember how we learned in the previous lecture that each HTML element has an opening tag, then some content, and then a closing tag. So here we don't have any content yet, but we will place it here right now. And now in here we can have other elements. Now in the case of the HTML element, it needs to have exactly two child elements. So two elements that are nested inside of it, because they are part of the common HTML structure. So here we always have a head element, and then we also have a body element. So just like this. Now the head of an HTML document is the part that is not displayed in the web browser when the page is loaded. So this is where we place stuff like the page title or links to CSS files. So let's actually start with that title, and for that we can use the title element. So we write title, and then here we can place the title. And so with title, what I mean is basically this title here that we will see in the browser. So up here in this tab bar. So let's actually give it the name of the app that we're building. Today I learned. Okay, let's save it just to make sure. And actually to give us a bit more space, I'm going to close down the sidebar here. So for that we can just click on the Explorer icon here. And so now we have a bit more space. Okay, so for now that's enough for the head, which again is the part that will not be visible. But now here we have our body. So most of our HTML will actually be in here. And let's start with one very popular element, which is the heading 1 element. So for the main heading of the page. And let's just start by writing here, hello world, which is a very common line of code or a line of text that we write when we first learn to program. All right. And so with this, we are now ready to actually see our results in the browser for the very first time. So to do that, we can actually simply go ahead and open this index.html file in the browser. So we can double click it, and here it is. So here we see the title that we wrote right here. So today I learned, we wrote inside the title element, and so now it is right here. So the browser has rendered it right here in this tab. And then, of course, we have the h1 element. So this one here is now translated to this big text. So just as we learned in the previous lecture, web browsers are able to basically translate the HTML code that we write to a visible output, such as this that we have here. Okay, so as I said, here we have the very common HTML structure, which is basically the same in every single HTML document that you are ever going to write. So it always starts with the HTML element, and then in there will be a head and there will be a body. And then inside the body is where we can get basically really creative. So we can write all kinds of HTML here, which is what we're going to do over the next few lectures. For now, I just want to show you a nice trick with which we can automatically write this structure basically in VS Code. So all we have to do is to write this exclamation mark and then hit tab. And here it is. So here again we have HTML, and then inside we have the head and the body. All right, so let's actually delete this here because this part here is a bit more complete. So let's get rid of that. And here we can again write today I learned, and then our h1 element again. And actually now we can write also today I learned right here, because that's the name of the app. And give it a save. And if we now reload the page over here, then of course that big heading changed to the text that we wrote right here. So here in the head, we now, besides this title, have some other metadata. For example, here this character set that is being used on the page, and then some other stuff that is not really important for us. So again, what matters to us is what goes here into the body. And so this is what we will start filling up over the next few lectures. In this lecture, we are going to place some text and a list into our application. And remember that this is the app that we are building in this course. And so the main part here is basically this list of facts. So in this lecture, we will now start building this list. So each of these facts has this text here and then also this category. Okay, so let's do that. Now the data here will come from this data.js file that was included in the starter files. So we placed that into our project folder in the last lecture. And so now just go ahead and open it up. So here we have these 3 facts, 1, 2, and 3. And each of it has all of this data. But mainly we're now interested here in this text. So let's copy the text and move back here to index.html. So let's create some space here. And then let's create our next HTML element. And since we are dealing with text, let's create a paragraph element. So that's the element that I showed you actually in the first lecture of this section. Right? So here we have this paragraph. And let's also get the other text. So for this second fact, and then we create another paragraph. All right. Give it a save, and then you see that prettier, so that extension that we installed in the first section automatically formatted our code here. Okay, so let's go back, make it a bit smaller again, and let's reload. And indeed, here are our 2 paragraphs. And you see they are nicely separated by the space which the browser automatically created because these are paragraphs. Okay. But now if we go back here, or actually we cannot really see it. But anyway, remember that we had these categories here, right? So let's get the text for each of these. So this one is called technology. And I will place it here and maybe place it between some special symbols. So this here has nothing to do with HTML. These are just some symbols I'm using here to make this text stand out a bit. Now remember how the category actually is its own element. So now we can't really see it, but so here it is. So the technology here should be its own element, right? And so what can we do here? Well, let's first try another paragraph, which is not really legal actually inside of HTML. So we cannot place one paragraph inside another one, but let's see what happens. Okay. And just like before, we could now simply manually reload the page, but we can also do something better, which is to now use the live server extension that we installed in our setup lecture. So that's very easy. All we have to do is to click the Go Live button down here. Then wait a second, and here it is. So it's the exact same page as before, but before we were basically loading it from this file directly, while now it's basically coming from a fake web server. So a local web server that runs on our computer. And so this enables some cool things. So watch what happens when I now change something here on the page. Let's say this. And now when I save it, then you see immediately this page got automatically reloaded, reflecting these latest changes. And of course, if I put it back, then it goes away. But actually what I'm interested in here is that this text here, so this technology, is now on a separate line, where in fact I actually want it to be right here. So instead of using the p element, which basically creates a new line whenever we create a new element, we can also use span. Give it a save, and now it is back here where it belongs. So span is basically a generic piece of text, but which doesn't create a new line. So it looks actually here as if it is not inside of any element, but it is. And so by doing that, we can then later style it using CSS as a separate piece of content from this. Okay, then let's do the same with the other one here. And also create a span element right here inside the paragraph. No, that's not correct. So society, and also give it these extra symbols here to make it look a little bit different. Okay, so we're already looking pretty good here, but we can actually do better. So if we think about it, our facts here are basically a big list of facts. So a list which contains all of these facts, right? So what we should actually do is to create a list inside of HTML where we then place basically these paragraphs. And that's very important because HTML is all about semantics. And with semantics, we simply mean that we should always use the HTML elements which has exactly the same meaning of the content that we are trying to display. So in this case, we know that we have a list of paragraphs, and therefore we should actually place them inside a list, even if the visual output will be the same. So let's create that list, but it is not called a list, not like this. It is called UL, which stands for unordered list. Okay, and then for each element of the list, so each list item, we need to create a li element. And then inside the li is where we place whatever content needs to be inside of this list item. So again, inside the URL, we can only have LIs, so list items. We cannot place, for example, the paragraph right here into the list. That's not allowed. So we want this to be a list item, so we need to tell the browser and we need to tell HTML that this is a list item by placing it inside the list item element. Okay, and let's do another one for this other paragraph. And so you see we are creating really a nested structure here of HTML elements, and that's just completely normal. So when we save it now, you see that it actually does look here like a list, but later on we will remove that styling. So you see that here it is basically simply a list of boxes, right? So without the bullet points. But the default styling of HTML is to give it these bullet points so that we can easily identify that it is a list. But what matters the most here for us is, again, the semantic meaning. So telling HTML and the browser that this is a list. And it's important to do that so that, for example, screen readers, which blind people use to navigate the web, can exactly identify what we have on our page. So it makes it possible for example, blind people to navigate our pages without any accessibility issues. All right, so we're making great progress. Let's take a break and continue in the next lecture. Next up, we will learn about HTML attributes by creating hyperlinks and by inserting images into our page. So, hyperlinks, or links for short, are one of the most important parts of the web. And so, of course, we need to learn how to do them in HTML. So here in our app, we have this source link after each of the facts so that the user can basically see where this fact comes from. So this is just a normal hyperlink. And so let's create one ourselves. So see how it says source here in all of them. And so the link text basically will be that. So just source. So let's start by creating that here. And where do you think we should place that? So you think it's here, after the paragraph, or right here, so inside the paragraph? Well, if the text, so if the link should appear right here close to this text, then it should probably also be inside of the paragraph. So just like this category here, right? So let's create that link here. And again, the element name is not what we might think it is, but instead we use the A element. And A stands for anchor. Okay? And remember that source was the text that we saw displayed on the page, right? However, of course, if we simply reload this now, then this is not a link, right? Because we haven't told HTML where that link should actually point to. So how do you think we can do that? So first of all, let's grab the URL. So in this case, that's this. So again, that's coming from the data.js, which contains all the information about each of the facts. So where do we put this URL to tell HTML where the link should actually point to? We will not just put it here, right? Because that will simply place it also here as text. We could try to put it in here, and that is already almost correct. So nothing still happens here. So this is not what we want, so let's cut it from here. And so the way that we indicate where the link should point to is by specifying the href attribute. So we write inside of this opening tag, we write href and then equal and then quotes, and then here we paste the link into. Give it a save, and then here you see the typical blue text, which now we can click, and then that will move right to our page. Okay, but let's go back here to our HTML. So this here is what we call an attribute, and basically an attribute is a property of the element. And let's actually specify another attribute here, which is the target attribute. Because notice how when we clicked this link here, it moved to the URL, but it was here on the same page. So let's do that again. So we moved to this page, but navigated away from our app. And so we need to go back. And instead what we want is this to open in a new tab so that our app can stay open basically at all times. So that's what we use the target attribute for. And the value that we give it is underscore blank. All right, give it a save. And if we click now, then it opens nicely in a new tab. And once we close it, we are back in our application. Nice. So let's do that here again to practice. So it's the anchor element. Then let's immediately close it. And then here between the opening tag and the closing tag is the text that we want to see on the page. And then let's get the source, which we will put in an attribute. So again, the href attribute, and this will basically be invisible. So whatever we specify as attributes will stay invisible. Okay, and we forgot the target blank. And yeah, that works. Nice. Now, of course, different elements will have different attributes. So if we specified the same thing here on the P, then nothing should work. So you see, everything looks the same here. And of course, we still cannot click on this paragraph because this special attribute only makes sense for the anchor element. Okay. So again, attributes are like invisible descriptions of an element, so that tell elements a bit better how they should work. So let's use another element that needs attributes in order to work, which is the image element. And the image element is special because of two reasons. First, because it needs attributes, as I just mentioned, but also because it is an element that has no closing tag. But let's see. So img stands for image, and then in order to close it, we simply write slash and then close it like this. All right. But now, how do we specify what image should actually be displayed? Well, that's again where attributes come into play. And in the case of the image, it is the source attribute. So src, which stands for source. And so the source is basically the path to the image in the file system. So in our case, what we want is to display this logo here. So we can actually double click on this logo here, and it will then open the image right here in VS Code. So this is the logo of our page, and we now want to include this image into our HTML document so that we can then see it here on our page. So that's something pretty normal, right? And it's also quite easy to do. So the image is right here in the same folder as index.html. And so all we need to do is to write logo.png. And VS Code is actually trying to help us here by auto-completing the path here. Okay. And so if I now give it a save, then you see it is right here. Beautiful. Now, if it was inside of some folder here, so imagine there was a folder called folder, then we would need to write that here as well. So specifying the path like that. So folder, and then in there, the logo. So folder / logo.png. But now there is no folder, and so this is how we do it. However, this image is way too big here, and so we can now use some more attributes to actually change that. So we can specify the height, and here it shows 68 pixels, and the same for the width. So we can also specify the width, and let's also set it to 68. Give it a save, and then it becomes much smaller. And of course, if I set it to something else here, then well, the browser would try to stretch it. But in this case, this logo is actually a square, and so the width needs to be the same as the height. All right. And we will talk again about these dimensions here once we talk about CSS. Finally, all logos should also have something called an alt text. So an alt text is basically a textual description of whatever is in the image, so that, again, images can also be read by screen readers. So by people who might be visiting our page but cannot see the content. So this image here is basically the logo of Today I Learned. So Today I Learned logo. Something like this. Okay, and visually nothing changes here, but that's not the point. So this text here is really only basically for screen readers and also for search engine optimization. Great. So now you know how to create images and also how to link to other pages, which is really great progress. As we start adding more and more content to our page, it's now time to give it a little bit of structure. So in any real-world web page or web app, we don't simply place all the elements one after another. Instead, what we do is to basically group them together by placing them into semantic boxes. So, for example, here this image and the h1 together, they might be the header of our page. So let's see that here in our original app. So basically all this part up here might be the header of the app, and then down here we have the main part of the app. And so for all that, we have special HTML elements. So elements with a semantic meaning, which, remember, means basically that we use the right element with the right meaning for the right place, so for the right content. So if we have a header here, so the top part of a page, we use the header element. Okay, and sometimes it's a bit annoying when VS Code automatically closes the element, because then we have to cut it and paste it here. Right? Or we could also have copy-pasted these here and place them in between the opening and closing tags. Okay? And if we give this a save now, then nothing really changed. But that was not the point anyway. The point here was simply to group these two elements together inside this box so that they have semantic meaning basically, and also so that later we can apply some styles to this. Because without these elements that belong together being basically in the same box, we can then not create layouts. Okay, so here we have the header, and then let's put this other content inside the main part of the page. And again, I will now cut this closing tag and place it here at the very end. So be very careful of where you place this. So it needs to be right after the closing tag of the list. And then when you save it, Prettier will again automatically format it nicely for you. And let's actually close down here or sidebar to see the content a bit better again. Okay, so we separated our page into main and header, which will, for example, allow us to create this space that we have between these two parts. So between this header and this main part here. Now, as you see inside the main, we actually also have two parts. So we have the list and we also have these buttons here. And so now let's actually create these buttons. Not all of them, because that's not the point here, but let's just create 3 of them. Okay, and that's actually the easiest thing in the world. So all we have to do is write button and then close it. And then simply the text. So that's all. Okay, and now of course when we click this button, nothing will happen. And that's because, as I mentioned before, HTML is really only for the content. If we want something to happen, then we need to write some JavaScript code, which of course we will do later in this course. Okay, and let's create some more here. So basically we have one button for each category. So for technology, science, finance, and so on and so forth, and then one for all of them. So technology and science. Okay, give it a save. But before we move back here, I want to draw your attention to the fact that this is also basically a list, right? So we have a list of buttons, even though once again, we don't see any bullet points here, but still semantically speaking, this is a list. And so we should also place these buttons here into a list. Okay, so now we just have the buttons side by side. And so let's create a list. And remember, we use the UL for unordered list, and then LI, which stands for list item. That's the easiest way to remember all these elements. Besides, of course, just practicing by writing them over and over again. Now, there are actually some shortcuts in VS Code so that we don't have to copy paste all the time like this. But I don't want to overwhelm you with all that stuff at this point. So let's just keep copy pasting, which we already know how to do. Great. Now, of course, we don't have the tools yet to place these two lists here side by side, because for creating a layout like this, we will of course need CSS. But at least we now have them all semantically each in a list. There's just one more thing that we can improve, which is to also put each of them in a box. So a box that has a little bit more meaning. So these buttons here, so this list, is basically like a sidebar in this app, right? And so for that, we can use the aside element. So aside doesn't really mean sidebar. It's more that it's like a secondary content. Okay, it's commonly used for sidebars though. So here aside, and then this I think is a good candidate for the section element. So this we can consider that it is a section of the page. All right. So now we need to search again for the closing tag of UL and place it right after. Give it a save. And yeah, I think that's it. So now we have basically 4 boxes here in our page, which later will be important for our layout. So we have the header, then we have the main part, and inside the main part, we have the aside, which will be the sidebar of buttons, and we have the main section of the app. So basically the list of facts. The only big part that is missing from the layout is this form right here. So this is where the user will be able to input new facts. And so let's actually code that form in the next lecture. In this lecture, let's learn how we can create a simple form with HTML. So that form should be located right here between the header and the main part, right? So that's exactly what we see here on this page. So let's actually write that here. And to create a form, we use the form element. Okay, and we can actually give the form element some special attributes, but for now that won't be necessary because just like the buttons that we created earlier, submitting this form will not do anything before we write some JavaScript to actually make it work. For now, we are just simply creating the content. But anyway, the first element that we have in our form is this text field here, right? And in HTML, that's called an input field. So input, and then let's say type text. And there can be other types like email, phone number, and so on. But this one is just the generic one simply for text. And that's actually it. So just like the image element, the input is also a self-closing element. So there's no content and there's no closing tag. Next up, we have this other one here, so this other input field. So let's write the exact same thing. Text and then self, close it. And then let's give it a save and check it out. So nothing special at this point, simply an input field that we can focus and type into. But yeah, nothing special yet. So next up, we have this one here, which is this drop down basically. So this is called in HTML a select element. And this one actually we do close because it needs some content. And the content of the select element is one option element for each of the options of the select field. So option, and here we do need an attribute, but more about that later. So first, the first one is technology. And then let's create another one for science, and then one for finance. Because this is basically the category that the user can choose for the fact that they are inputting. So here we have these 8 categories, which are exactly the same as these buttons. But again, we are keeping it simple here. And that's because later on, we will actually create many of these elements using JavaScript. So basically, we will have some code which will then create this list here for us. So the select element. So just to explain you, it will take this data here, which has the names of all the categories, and it will then basically automatically create one option element for each of these. And so then we don't have to manually do this. But for now, we're just learning how HTML works, and so this is how we do it. So when we come here now, we have one of these elements that I'm sure that you've seen many, many times before when using the web, where we can select one of the options. Now here we need to specify an attribute, which is the value attribute. And here let's just call it technology. Okay. And this will be important later when the form is submitted. So an option always needs to have the value. So in this case, the values are simply the categories here. Okay, so visually that doesn't change anything. And now finally, the button. And let's just say post. So to post this fact to the app. So beautiful. Actually, here we have another option, which is called choose category, basically just to tell the user what they should do here. So let's do the same. So basically creating another option here. And here, let's actually leave it empty, because this one is very different. We never want the user to actually select this one. So we'll leave it empty, which will make more sense a bit later when we actually make this form work. So choose category. Okay, and now to finish, you see that here in this input field and this other one, we have this placeholder. So we have this grayed out text, but then when we write something, we get a normal color text, so a white text. And so this is what we call a placeholder, and this is also done with HTML. So how do you think that works? Well, that is just another HTML attribute. And in this case, it's the placeholder attribute. And here, once more, as we start typing, VS Code will start to suggest us some options. So we can simply hit enter here. And so that makes typing a little bit faster. So share a fact with world. And then here, another placeholder, trustworthy source. And so like this, the user will know exactly what to type into each of these fields. Beautiful. So it's starting to look a little bit more like an actual web application, right? So very nice. There's just one more thing missing from this form, if you remember, which is here, this number. So this number will later indicate how many characters are left to write. So you see, as we start typing, this number goes down. Now, usually when the page has the original big size, like this, you see that all of these here are side by side, including that number here. So just like here, where we have all the form elements side by side, that's what we want here as well. What we have here is simply an adaptation for smaller screens. But anyway, this was just to ask you, what do you think which element we need to basically place this 200 here in our form? So between these two input elements. So right here, what element do you think we will need? Well, let's start with the very first that we tried or that we learned, which was the P element, remember? So do you think this will be correct? Well, not really, because remember that the P element actually created a new line. So that's exactly what we had in the very beginning of the section, where when we placed this technology here, so this category into a P, then it also created a new line which we didn't want. Remember that? So it was this situation here. And that's why we used a span, which is simply basically a neutral text element which does not create a new line. And so therefore, that's exactly what we want here as well. So just text, but without creating any new lines. All right, and so now we are actually almost done here with the skeleton of our app, so to say. So basically the main content, we now have it laid out here. All that is missing is this part here. So you see that each of these facts has basically these three buttons here, where we can upvote a fact, we can say that it's a mind-blowing fact, or we can say that it's actually false. Because of course, some people might post wrong facts here, and then people can downvote them so that they don't appear. So let's take care of that in the next lecture and then finish the HTML part of our application. So we're actually already almost ready with this section. All there's left to do for now is to add some buttons all over the interface. So as I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, what we need to do now is to basically add these three buttons here to each of the facts. So to each of these list items here, right? So that shouldn't be too hard, right? So let's come here to each of these facts. So basically each of these list items that we have inside our list is a fact. And so now, well, we simply add these buttons here. So button, which again doesn't do anything. And then here we want this emoji. So we're using these three emojis for upvoting, for mind-blowing, and for false, basically. Now on a Mac, you can get the emoji picker by using Control, Command, and then the spacebar. So that will look like this. Or on Windows, you can use the window key plus the period sign. So this one here. Or if you just cannot make it work somehow, then I also, to help you, pasted these emojis here into data.js. So down here. So actually I will just come here and copy them. So this is for the upvote. And in the first fact, we have 24 votes for interesting, 9 for mind-blowing, and 4 for false. So basically the same numbers that we have over there. And yeah, these numbers, they actually don't even matter anyway. It's just so that we have something. Okay, so that's the first. Here the number is 9, and I will get the emoji in a second. And then 4. So let's grab them both. But again, you can just do this. So that's Control, Command, Space on a Mac, and the Windows plus the period sign. Okay. All right, I deleted the 4. So let's just take a look at what that looks like. And now I need to reload it. Sometimes that's necessary. And okay, so here are the 3 buttons, but there are some things that are wrong with it, so that are different. And let's start with the first thing, which is that here, this text is actually bold. So that's easy to do because there is an HTML element just for that. And actually there are 2 of them. So one is simply the B element. So just B, which stands for bold. And so indeed it makes the text bold. However, that B is not a semantic element. So it's not an element that has some meaning. And so in a newer version of HTML, which is HTML5, we instead of the B tag or the B element, we use strong. So strong basically means that this is very important text. And then as a consequence of that, the browser will make it bold. So it still is bold, but now it has the meaning that the text is very important. So the B is more for formatting, which should be for CSS, while strong actually has some meaning. And if you think that's all the same, or that it doesn't really matter, well, that's not a problem too. Because in fact here all we want to do is to really make it work. All right, so that looks nice. But now there's one more thing, which is that very clearly here, these 3 buttons here are grouped together, right? So they are here below all of this, and they are kind of nicely in a group. So they are basically in a box. And we already know how to do that, right? Because we created many boxes before. So boxes with meanings. So we created the header, which is basically a box. Form is also just a box which holds some stuff. And we have main, aside, and section. However, these buttons here, they don't really have any of those meanings. And so here we can just use a generic box, which basically has no meaning at all. It's just really just a box. And this is called a div. So let's grab the buttons and put it inside of this box. And so since this is a box, this will now create basically a new line. So yeah, so just like this. So this box basically goes all the way here and it creates a new line before it and after it. But that's no problem because we will fix that later with CSS. So keep in mind that when we're writing HTML, we really only care about the content, really not about what it looks like. Okay. But anyway, let's just copy the buttons here and then just update the numbers a little bit. Let's see what we have. So 11, 2, and 0. So 11 to 0. And there we go. Now, actually, I'm noticing something wrong here. So we did something that is not really allowed, and which in fact doesn't make a lot of sense. So we created this div here, so this box, right inside of the paragraph. And again, that really doesn't make a lot of sense. So instead, this is just another element inside of the list. So I just cut it here and move it outside of the paragraph. Oh, okay. And now the same thing here. So a div inside a paragraph doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay, and now I saved it, and now it looks exactly the same, but now it is correct. So we have the paragraph, and then after the paragraph, we have this box. So the box with the buttons. Okay, and now we're almost done. The only thing that's left is, well, besides completing all these buttons here, so the only thing that's left is still this button here. So this button here says close when the form is open, and it says share effect when it's closed. But again, of course, that is only possible with JavaScript. So that's one of the dynamic effects that I mentioned in the first section. So of course we can't do that now, but I will already put this button here. And as you see, it is right here in the header. So let's put that here in our header box. Okay. So it's a button, and the text is share a fact. And so then later we will have the button open the form. For now, nothing works, of course. And all right, that's actually already it. So that's the HTML that we need to get started with our project. So I hope that you had some fun writing this code with me, that you learned a thing or two, or many things, hopefully. And yeah, if you want to now style it, so to make it look very close to this one here, then let's very quickly move on right to the next section. So I hope to see you there very soon.